We've been talking for decades now about our dependence on foreign oil, our dependence on fossil fuels, the lack of an energy policy, and we haven't done anything about it. And the consequences are dire. We know that global warming is real, that if we don't do anything about global climate change, that we could see catastrophic results. Everything from increased hurricanes to rising sea levels to famine, changing weather patterns, increased drought, wildfires. When I think about my two daughters, I want to make sure that they can enjoy beaches and mountains and landscapes that I enjoyed growing up. That means being a good steward for this environment. We also know that as a consequence of our dependence on foreign oil, our economy is more vulnerable. Every time the spot oil market goes up, we not only are having to cough up more money at the gas pump, but it costs our businesses and increases inflation without really providing us any value whatsoever. When I meet a family where the husband has to drive 30 miles to work and the wife has to drive 20 miles to work and gas goes up 50 cents, that's a real hit to their pocketbook, and they feel it. And that may mean that they can't get a computer for their child. It may mean that they aren't saving as much for the child's college education. In some cases, it means that they can't get to work. So these aren't abstract questions for people. And the only way that we're going to reduce gas prices over the long term is to reduce demand. There are no quick fixes. What I have said is that we should impose a fee or a tax on the windfall profits of oil companies that can be put into new development. If we increased fuel efficiency standards to 45 miles per gallon, we could save the equivalent of all the oil that we import from the Persian Gulf. The technology exists to do it. What's been lacking is the sense of political will and urgency. And oil and gas companies and the automakers have all too often blocked the kind of progress that needs to happen. And that's why when I unveiled my proposal to increase fuel efficiency standards, I didn't just go to an environmental group in California. I went to Detroit. Today, there are two kinds of car companies: those that mass produce fuel efficient cars and those that will. And I have to admit that the room was quiet when I made the speech. The automakers didn't embrace it, but it's the right thing to do. And I think we're at a stage now where it's important for us not just to tell people what they want to hear, we've got to tell people what they need to hear. Right now, our fuel efficiency standards are lower than China's, which is embarrassing. A second component is what fuels we're putting into those cars. We've got to embrace biofuels. We've got to move not just on corn-based ethanol, but cellulosic ethanol and using wood chips to create energy. There are all sorts of energy approaches that can be taken so that our cars are burning cleaner fuel. And that's why I've proposed a national low-carbon fuel standard that would require 10% clean energy in all gasoline blends. If we did those two things together, you take the national low-carbon fuel standard and increase fuel efficiency standards, we could take the equivalent of 50 million cars worth of pollution off the road by the year 2020. A third thing that we can do is to set up a renewable energy standard. Many states are already doing this. You say 20% of our energy will come from renewable sources, like wind, like solar, like biomass, like hydrothermal. But we've got to overcome a politics prevents these common sense solutions from being put into place. When Dick Cheney put his energy bill together on behalf of George Bush, he met with the environmental groups once, the renewable energy folks once, and then he met with the oil and gas folks 40 times. And there's no wonder then that the system was skewed in the wrong direction. We've got to make sure that the oil companies, the gas companies, the automakers, that they aren't dominating the conversation. They should have a seat at the table, but they can't buy all the chairs. They can't write the legislation. And finally, we know that our dependence on foreign oil has perverse consequences to our foreign policy. We know that we're sending $800 million a day to hostile nations and helping to fuel both sides of the war on terrorism. And that is something that I think increasingly people recognize as a consequence of the war in Iraq. So we've got to take fundamental steps to make changes in all these fronts. We have to understand that we've got a moral obligation to the next generation to make sure that they've got a planet that is sustainable and viable, the same way that we inherited a sustainable, viable planet from our parents and our grandparents. I think young people in particular recognize the importance of this issue, and in their own day-to-day lives, they are trying to make sure that they are carbon neutral and not wasteful. And all those things add up. But we have to have leadership in Washington that is willing to rally around these issues. We can't have the kinds of policies that just through regulatory fiat, through a stroke of the pen, the president has decided we can lop off mountains in the Appalachians. That kind of disregard for the long-term energy future of America is something that is unacceptable. And the American people understand that, and they want a president who's going to help lead the way on this issue, and most importantly, make sure that we meet those moral obligations to future generations and preserve the beauty of this planet.